Hi painters. I am going to do a little mixing here with our colors. I've already transferred, we're dealing with a red-green limited palette for this next project. And I've got two reds out. We've got our alizarin crimson and cadmium red and our viridian green. I've placed out some blue, ultramarine blue, and some yellow. I'll probably need a little more of that. And transferred from my other palette a green that I mixed using yellow and viridian green. So that's this particular green. This was made with ultramarine blue and yellow, but I'm going to mix a little bit more just to show you what I'd like you to do when you begin this painting and the basic process for mixing your paint before you begin your painting. So, and also to talk about the properties of red and green via your palette. So I'm just gonna say we have, this green here, we've got this one. I'm going to want to probably mix another green with my blue and yellow to just kind of give yourself a head start. You can, of course, continue to mix these different greens as you see fit and necessary moving forward with your painting, but it's nice to just start out with some paint mixed up, right? And also just to kind of demonstrate again how we use the palette knife to mix your paint and mix it thoroughly. Maybe take half of that and maybe I'll mix a lighter yellow and add a little bit more yellow to that so that you can have a good variety to start with. So green, as we know, we have our secondary colors, we have our tertiary colors, your yellow greens, your blue greens, and you can mix up a small amount of each of those. But I think this would probably suit you well enough to begin where you've got your viridian, which is in effect a blue-green, and you've got a yellow-green, you've got a yellower viridian green, so a cooler green than this yellow green, and you've got a middle green. We want to get rid of all the blue on the palette before we start painting, just so that we don't reach for blue when we're mixing with a limited palette, meaning red and green. We don't want yellow or blue to really be on the palette because we want to just see what our limited palette is. If we have yellow or blue in its pure form, we're going to reach for it when we see something bluish. So I'm going to ask you to just kind of mix up. Maybe I'll, for fun, see what a blue, and I didn't clean this off because it's got green on it, and I kind of think it's all going to work out because I've got blue and yellow and green mixing together here. So I'm getting another kind of lovely blue-green. So with a limited palette, if you're aware of your tertiary colors having a blue-green, instead of reaching for a blue when you see a bluish color that you want to get down, you'll reach for your blue-green, right? And then you're still staying in that limited palette. And we'll talk more about what a limited palette will do in the painting itself and the challenges that it poses. So I'm going to wipe this down. And then I'm just going to go ahead and take the blue off of the palette for now. So as we work with this limited palette, we've got a bunch of greens, and you'll notice that we only have two reds. And that's because I can't mix red because it's a primary color. And so we're dealing with what these greens can do in conjunction with these reds, and we do have white. One of the things that you might want to look at is what does white do to each of these colors? And when we add white to a color, what we're doing is tinting that color. We are also doing something called desaturating the color. So a color without white in it, or without black in it, or without gray in it, is considered to be saturated color. So saturated color is a color that has not been affected by black, white, or gray. And so when we add white to a color, that desaturates it. So you can check out what a color looks like with white in it, and also know that that can be part of your palette that you can use in your painting. So I'm adding white to this Viridian green, and it really kind of shows you how that color changes in a lighter value. Obviously, it is much lighter, and it really brings out its coolness and the way that it's almost, I mentioned it has a blue-green quality to it. It has almost like an aqua, beautiful quality to it. So that's what the Viridian looks like with some white. And if we add some white here and look at what this sort of middle green does, green mixed with ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow. So it's a similar value, lightness or darkness, but has a very different quality to it and would have a different use depending on what you're painting. So these are both greens with white in it, and both have very different feeling. So you might want to add white to each one of these. Some people, when they begin a painting, they like to do a little value scale of each one. I don't think that's really necessary because you may or may not use those, and also white is an easy thing to add to something, a quick adjustment for the value that you think you're going to have. But some people really like to do that, and if you're in the habit of doing that because you're already a painter, go for it. I will also show in the red form what happens when we add white to the cadmium red. And you'll notice something interesting. I added a pretty good amount of white to that red. Certain colors have a high pigment content, meaning that it takes more white to tint it lighter, and certain colors tint up very quickly. They have a lower pigment value. So you're just noticing that beautiful light red with nothing else added to it, noticing what those colors look like when you tint them with the white. And this is your alizarin crimson, the darker of the two reds, the more transparent of the two reds. And let's just check out what white does to that. Again, I'm wiping down my palette knife as best as possible in between mixing with different colors so you can really see what these specific colors do. And so mixing my white into this color, you can see that it retains sort of its coolness as a sort of a more purpley type or bluish type red, and a sort of more muted, less brilliant or vibrant kind of a red. When you add white to anything, it's going to cool it. So this was a red that felt very warm, and when you add white to it, it's going to cool it off a little bit. And so a cool red looks even cooler. Okay, so in this particular palette, again, we're just dealing with red and green. And one of the things that you're then going to need to know about the red and green is how they interact with each other, literally when they're mixed together. We've already talked a little bit about how the colors as complements are in their pure saturated form next to each other, and how they make each other either brighter or tone each other down or make sort of a vibration between the two of them. Primarily your eye is looking for the other color in each other, and that creates a vibration in your eye, which adds excitement to the visual impact of complements being together next to each other. Mixing complements into each other has a different effect, and let's just start by using the cadmium red, and we will mix the green into it. I'm going to choose this green because it's sort of a middle value green that is similar in value to the red, and I'll mix about the same amount into each other, and we'll see what happens. So when you mix a complement with its complement, a color with its complement, you notice that it darkens the color and it muddies the color, it desaturates the color, but it doesn't take the color away. So in this case, I can see that it still looks quite red, but it's much less red than it originally was, and it's deeper. So that is the red desaturated with green. Now, if we wanted to show what the green looks like desaturated with red, we would want more of a quantity of the green. So you might notice that I added more or the same amount of green as red, but it stayed quite red. And that's because the tinting power of that red is greater than the tinting power of the green. So to make a green feel like it's being desaturated by the red, but still a green, you now have learned, like, oh, I need less red, right? If I want to show that. So I'm mixing the green in with that red-green mixture, but allowing the green to contain and keep its own identity. So I'll put that there. This is this green mixed with red, where it still is a kind of a green. It's a desaturated green, and it's been desaturated by its complement. So earlier I mentioned ways that we desaturate color are by adding black, by adding white and tinting, or by adding gray. You don't have black, you don't have gray. We're mixing and desaturating color by using its complement. So if you were to mix these two together and continue to mix them until you feel like the color that you're seeing before you is neither red nor green, that would be considered a neutral. And that is ultimately what complements do with each other, is they neutralize each other. If they are in the right quantity and you mix and mix and mix until you feel like, yep, I think that's neither red nor green. And that takes kind of developing your eye and thinking about stuff. And with this particular red and green, that neutral might look actually brown. And that's another thing that I'd like you to do, is to play with these reds and greens together and see if you can mix a neutral color. And so that's what I'm doing here with these particular red and greens, and I'm mixing one that feels like maybe it'll be a little more neutral here by adding more green to it. And then that would be a nice neutral browny kind of mixture. Another way to look at this and to think about it as a neutral would be to add white to it. And so I'm going to add white to it to kind of show you how it makes what we will call a chromatic gray. So chromatic gray is when you add two complements together until they form a neutral, and then add white to that. It actually doesn't need white in its form. It is technically a chromatic gray, but when you add white to it, you start to think of it as a gray. And it's one of these colors that's sort of like, is it a beige? Is it a khaki? All of those neutral colors that we're not quite sure what they are. When you can't say it's green or red, it's a neutral. And that's what this is. So these are important colors to mix for painting, absolutely. And sometimes we use these colors to bring interest to our neutrals that we're observing, and beauty to the colors in their purer form. So this right here can become a lovely palette to work with. And in this next painting, we'll really explore that. So what we've done so far is to mix a couple of greens. We've tinted a couple of those greens. We've tinted a couple of the reds. And then we mixed a green and a red together to desaturate the red and show it in its darker form. We've mixed red into the green, but allowed it to keep its green identity. And then we mixed a neutral between the red and green until we didn't feel like it had red or green as its identity, and made a gray and tinted gray. So that's what this particular palette can do 10 times over, because you can then start to mix different reds and greens together. So for instance, I've got this alizarin crimson, and if I wanted to mix it with the Viridian to show what that does, and I just mixed a little bit, it just deepens it, right? And it makes it still absolutely the Viridian, the alizarin crimson, but it's deeper. And so if you were painting an object and it were in shadow and it still had this very beautiful red color, but it just needed to get a little bit deeper or a little bit less intense, you would add its complement. You could add this as a complement and it would do a different thing. I'm going to add a little bit more Viridian to that. Alizarin, and you can see you get kind of a very deep kind of color here, and it almost feels like a black, and it also almost feels like a violet. And the reason that it almost feels like a violet is because this is sort of a bluish green, and a blue green with the blue in it mixed with a red that already feels slightly on the purple side is going to head towards a purplish color. And so when I add a little bit of white to that, we'll see how far from that is true, but we should get a very nice neutral. So just adding Viridian and alizarin, we get a really beautiful neutral that has perhaps a bit of violet tone to it. So surprising combinations, right? You wouldn't think if you add red and green together that you're going to get sort of a purpley, steely, beautiful gray, but you are. And so this is a limited palette that has, again, very expansive possibilities. And that's why we're starting with the limited palette. We're not working with blue, that's gone. We're not working with yellow, we're using blue-green, we're using yellow-green, and we're playing with mixing these together to see what kind of neutrals we can get by using color theory, by putting complements together in different quantities. In this next project, you'll use some of these colors more than others, but I would like you to mix up all of, some varieties of greens. Make sure you have a yellow green, a blue green, Viridian out of the tube, tint a couple of them, tint a couple of your reds and check those out, and then play with mixing complements. So now I'm mixing the Viridian and the tint just to see how different it will look because of the quantities of these two together. So again, with more alizarin crimson, then Viridian, we're going to get kind of a beautiful violet. And then we'll see if we mix our yellow green, which mixed with ultramarine blue and yellow, and we mix some cadmium red with that. So these are complements. We're seeing what that does. And that gives almost an orangey tint to that, doesn't it? And that's because the yellow and the yellow-green and the red are heading it toward an orangey type color. So you start to see just the amazing variety that you're going to get using this limited palette. Can you mix in between colors and not just deal with certain reds and greens? Yeah, you can. And so in other words, you could say, well, I'm going to see what it looks like if I add alizarin crimson to that as well, because I want it to be deeper and redder. And so you get that going. See what I just did? I just smushed a little bit on there. And that's no big deal. But just be aware, sometimes I get stuff on my palette knife and then I just don't deal with it. I get wasting a lot of paint. But so yeah, so you can have that kind of situation happening. You could, you know, take this mixture here that was sort of a, you know, middle green, and add with that was tinted, and add red to it to see what kind of, you know, pinkish you could get, a muted pink. So do this, play with things, and using that theory that we're talking about mixing our complements together. And you can place things when things get a little busy on your palette, you can take things away and kind of put them over to the side. This will eventually dry and you can use that for mixing for the next part of the project. Some of you will just be really organized and have it all out to the side, and that's great. Each of you will do that differently. So I'll pause this now. On the next one, we'll talk about using the palette knife or the brush onto the painting. We'll talk about what you're painting. But this is just getting your limited palette mixed up on your palette paper. Okay, hope that works for you.